You think the worst part about getting fired is losing your paycheck. It is not. The absolute worst part is when the arrogant fools kicking you out have no idea they just pulled the pin on a financial hand grenade. And you simply smile, slip the safety pin into your pocket, and walk out, waiting for the explosion. This is exactly how my stolen corner office incinerated a $250 million deal. Hello and welcome to the loyal listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. We want to thank you sincerely for your continued support, but unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization features, leaving us with absolutely no budget to operate, which means we will soon be forced to stop publishing new videos publicly on this platform. If you enjoyed today's story and want to help us survive, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you can listen to exclusive true revenge stories that are much longer, featuring intricate details we cannot share on YouTube and brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors. You can join us right now by simply scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link located in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's tale of corporate greed and silent destruction. And my name is Chloe Griffin. To truly grasp the sheer magnitude of the stupidity I faced, you first need to picture the corporate environment at Aegis Core Dynamics. We were a mid-sized virtualization technology firm located right in the heart of Denver. I was 34 years old and served as the facility security officer for the entire corporation. In a company that dealt with highly sensitive federal information, my job was the only protective barrier standing between our executive board and a federal prison sentence. But in the modern landscape of American tech startups and corporate buyouts, strict legal compliance is often treated like an annoying roadblock, especially when your leadership structure runs entirely on nepotism, unearned confidence, and endless venture capital money. It was a bright Monday morning when I received a sudden calendar invite to visit the Human Resources Department. I walked into the glass-walled conference room and immediately saw our chief executive officer sitting next to the visibly uncomfortable HR director, and standing right behind them, wearing a ridiculously expensive designer turtleneck and a smug, entitled grin, was Kyler. Kyler was the CEO's brand new brother-in-law. He was a walking, breathing cliché of a tech industry crypto bro, the exact kind of guy who constantly threw around empty buzzwords like disruptive, agile, and decentralized without having the faintest idea what those concepts actually meant in a practical, real-world setting. I took a seat, and the CEO cleared his throat to deliver the news. I was being let go, effective immediately. He tried to soften the blow by calling it a strategic restructuring of the compliance department to better align with the company's futuristic vision. But I knew the absolute truth. It had absolutely nothing to do with my job performance, my meticulous records, or the recent federal audits I had passed with flying colors. It was all about the real estate. My corner office featured a stunning panoramic view of the Rocky Mountains. Kyler had visited the corporate headquarters exactly 2 weeks prior, taken a brief tour of my workspace, and decided right then and there that he wanted it. It was truly that simple, and that incredibly pathetic. I was losing my primary source of income and my career at the company simply because an arrogant, inexperienced kid wanted a pretty background for his online video calls. Then came the ultimate punchline. The CEO proudly announced that Kyler would be stepping in to fill my shoes under the newly invented, completely meaningless title of Director of Compliance Optimization. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Kyler had absolutely zero federal security clearances. He did not even possess a basic understanding of network infrastructure. Just the week before, I had overheard him telling a group of developers in the break room that all government legal procedures and security protocols could easily be automated and solved by artificial intelligence within the next few months. They were knowingly handing the keys of a highly regulated, government-facing security infrastructure to a man who genuinely believed a basic computer algorithm could smooth-talk the United States Department of Defense. The CEO leaned forward across the table, watching my face closely, expecting a dramatic reaction. He braced himself for a flood of tears. He waited for me to beg for my job, to list my countless late-night hours, to remind him that I was the sole individual in the entire building legally qualified to manage the federal guidelines. He wanted to feel powerful and generous by offering me a measly severance package in exchange for my dignity. Instead, I gave him absolutely nothing. The sheer, overwhelming absurdity of the situation washed over me, leaving behind a cold, crystal-clear sense of clarity. I looked directly into the CEO's eyes, then shifted my gaze to Kyler, and offered a soft, genuinely pleasant smile. I gave a slight, respectful nod. "Understood," I said, ensuring my voice was completely steady and completely devoid of any anger. "I wish Kyler the best of luck with my systems." The CEO blinked rapidly, clearly unsettled by my calm demeanor. He had prepared for a bitter fight, not a peaceful surrender, but I knew something they were far too ignorant to understand. I knew the intricate, unforgiving nature of the compliance networks I managed. I stood up gracefully, smoothed my skirt, and walked back down the hallway to my soon-to-be former office to pack my belongings. The collection of my personal items was slow and methodical. I took my personal espresso machine, carefully wrapping the power cord. I picked up the framed photograph of my golden retriever and placed it gently into my cardboard moving box. I stood back and looked at the heavy wooden bookshelf lining the entire back wall. It was filled top to bottom with thick, color-coded binders containing all the procedural manuals, disaster recovery protocols, and compliance guides I had painstakingly written and organized over the last 4 years. I could have easily thrown them all into the shredder. I could have packed them into my box and taken my intellectual property with me. Instead, I deliberately chose to leave every single one of them right there on the shelf. I wanted Kyler to have full, unrestricted access to the manuals. I wanted them to eventually realize that having the instructions means absolutely nothing if you do not have the brain capacity to comprehend the complex legal language they are written in. I picked up my box and walked out of the office for the final time. As I stepped into the main hallway, Kyler rushed past me without a single word of acknowledgement. He was far too busy holding a digital measuring tape, eagerly calculating the floor space to see exactly where he could fit his brand new foosball table. He did not bother to look at me, and I certainly did not waste a single second looking back at him. I walked straight out of the sliding glass doors of Aegis Core Dynamics, with my head held high and my professional pride completely intact. The crisp, cold Denver air hit my face as I reached the parking lot. A genuine, terrifying smile broke across my face as I unlocked my car. They truly thought they had won the game. They thought they had cleanly removed an obstacle and upgraded their family members' office real estate. But as I started my engine, I knew the irreversible truth. The silent, invisible countdown clock had officially started ticking. To truly grasp the sheer, suffocating magnitude of the catastrophe Aegis Core Dynamics was blindly hurtling toward, you have to understand the fragile financial quicksand beneath the company floorboards. For the past 3 years, our chief executive officer had been treating the corporate treasury like his personal, endlessly refilling piggy bank. He burned through our Series B funding on leased private jets, extravagant weekend retreats in the Swiss Alps, and a fleet of luxury sports cars for his inner circle of yes men. The company was bleeding capital at a fundamentally unsustainable rate. The hushed conversations by the water cooler were constantly filled with dread about missed payrolls and bouncing vendor checks. We were sitting right on the razor edge of total bankruptcy. But then, a singular, massive miracle appeared on the horizon. We were in the final stages of locking down a $250 million contract with the United States Department of Defense. We were selected to provide highly advanced, real-time virtualization encryption software for their new mobile command units deployed overseas. It was the ultimate golden ticket. That $250 million was the only lifeline left to pull the company out of a very deep, very dark financial grave. The entire executive suite was already mentally spending the money, completely blinded by their own desperate greed. What those arrogant executives consistently failed to grasp was the cold, hard reality of military procurement. Doing business with the Pentagon is not like selling consumer software to a trendy civilian startup. The military does not operate on firm handshakes. visionary slide decks, or verbal promises over expensive dinners. They operate on rigid, unforgiving federal law. Specifically, this monumental contract mandated a strict adherence to the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification at Level 3. Level 3 is not a mere suggestion or a friendly checklist you can fake. It requires an ironclad, physically secured server environment, rigorous continuous monitoring, and military-grade encryption handled exclusively by cleared personnel. Here is the terrifying, inescapable reality that the chief executive officer conveniently ignored when he decided to hand my job to his relative. I was the absolute only individual in that entire building who held the active, nationally recognized facility security officer clearance required to oversee that specific contract. I was the singular, legal linchpin holding the entire deal together, every single week. The Department of Defense required an authenticated security compliance report, digitally signed by me and my encrypted physical token, just to keep the contract in the active negotiation phase. Without my verified credentials, the company was essentially an untrusted ghost in the eyes of the federal government. But in stepped Kyler, the golden boy of the family tree, completely ready to optimize our outdated processes. To a guy like Kyler, rigid federal security regulations were nothing but an annoying joke. He openly referred to them as outdated paperwork from the previous generation. He genuinely, wholeheartedly believed that speed and disruption were infinitely more important than national security protocols. Within hours of my departure, my former contacts inside the engineering department quietly informed me of his very first major executive decision: to cut overhead costs and immediately demonstrate his genius leadership to his brother-in-law. Kyler ordered the complete dismantling of the isolated, air-gapped hardware servers I had painstakingly built specifically for the military data. Instead, he initiated a mass, unencrypted migration of all our preliminary defense contract frameworks onto a cheap, publicly accessible commercial cloud service he took classified. Highly sensitive federal encryption frameworks, and threw them onto the exact same unsecure hosting platforms used by teenage beauty bloggers and discount shoe retailers. It was the digital equivalent of leaving the detailed blueprints to a nuclear submarine on a public park bench just to save a few dollars on a proper safe. The most tragic and infuriating part of this incoming disaster was that it was entirely preventable. This was not Kyler's first brush with catastrophic, fireable incompetence. Exactly 6 months prior, when he was just a senior intern playing around in the development sandbox, he had attempted to bypass our internal firewalls to install unauthorized cryptocurrency mining software on company hardware. I caught the network intrusion immediately. I drafted 4 separate, highly detailed red alert emails outlining exactly how his reckless actions constituted a critical breach of our preliminary government security agreements. I sent them directly to the chief executive officer, explicitly demanding Kyler be removed from the building before he jeopardized our federal clearance. The response I got was deafening silence. The chief executive officer had quietly accessed the central administrative server and permanently deleted every single one of those emails. He deliberately buried the evidence to protect his sister's new husband, completely ignoring the massive legal liabilities he was harboring. He knowingly chose family loyalty over federal compliance, sealing his own fate long before I ever walked out the door. So, while Kyler was busy measuring my old corner office for a game table and treating military-grade data like a weekend college project, I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear. I did not call an employment lawyer to fight for my stolen job. Instead, I spent my first week of unemployment sitting comfortably in a leather booth at a dimly lit craft pub in downtown Denver. The air smelled warmly of roasted malt and fried food. I ordered a cold, bitter India Pale Ale, pulled out my laptop, and took my time carefully updating my professional profile on LinkedIn. I listened to the soft jazz playing over the pub speakers and watched the busy city traffic outside the frosted windows. I felt an overwhelming, deeply satisfying sense of peace. I knew with absolute, chilling certainty that not a single person left inside the Aegis Corps building had the technical literacy, let alone the required security clearance, to read the automated system error codes. Right at that very moment, those digital warnings were silently, invisibly accumulating in the background of their cheap cloud servers like a ticking time bomb. The trap was perfectly set. The poisoned bait was swallowed whole, and the slow, inevitable machinery of federal justice was already waking up in the dark. The truth of the matter is that my flawless, silent departure on that Monday morning was not a spontaneous stroke of luck or a sudden burst of emotional control. It was the final, meticulously calculated move of a chess match I had already won 48 hours earlier. In the corporate world, especially in a mid-sized tech company running on gossip and nepotism, there are always loud whispers before the executioner swings the axe. Human resources departments are notoriously terrible at keeping their digital tracks hidden. By the previous Thursday afternoon, I had caught the subtle, unavoidable shifts in the office atmosphere. I noticed the sudden avoidance of eye contact in the hallways, the hushed conversations that abruptly went dead silent the second I walked into the communal break room, and the clumsy, unauthorized calendar blocks appearing on the executive schedule regarding office allocations. I knew Kyler desperately wanted my physical workspace, and I knew the chief executive officer was morally weak enough to hand it to him on a silver platter. So, long before they ever called me into that glass-walled conference room to deliver their poorly rehearsed script, I walked into my secure, restricted access terminal room, firmly closed the heavy soundproof door behind me, and quietly logged directly into the United States Department of Defense contractor portal. I navigated through the brutal, archaic, text-based interface of the federal government network to locate a very specific, highly consequential legal document. It was the formal emergency withdrawal of Security Oversight Declaration. The sheer beauty of federal compliance law is that it is entirely devoid of human emotion and strictly designed to ruthlessly protect the integrity of the national security grid, completely ignoring the fragile egos or the financial desires of corporate executives. Under the rigid guidelines of my clearance, if I had even a reasonable suspicion that I was being removed from my oversight position, or if I was forcibly terminated by a compromised management team, my sole legal obligation was to immediately notify the federal government to protect their data. I had absolutely zero legal duty to warn the corporate board of directors, especially when they were the exact individuals initiating the breach of protocol. I filled out the digital paperwork with cold, methodical precision. I detailed my impending, involuntary removal from the facility and formally severed my personal, legal, and financial liability from Aegis Core Dynamics. I took a deep breath, clicked submit, and watched the gray loading bar confirm that my protective legal umbrella was officially withdrawn. But filing the digital paperwork was only the first half of the trap. The physical hardware was the actual, fatal trigger to securely interact with the military servers and sign off on our weekly deliverables. I utilized a specialized hardware token. It was a thick, black plastic device that generated a constantly rotating, highly encrypted 6-digit numerical code every 60 seconds. Without that physical token, you could not authorize a single line of code, upload a single document, or verify a single compliance report to the military, a standard. Friendly corporate transition would typically require me to hand that token over to my successor so they could seamlessly take over the network duties. But Kyler did not hold a top-secret clearance. Giving that highly restricted device to an uncleared, unverified civilian constitutes a severe federal crime under the Espionage Act. Therefore, strictly adhering to the exact letter of the law to protect myself, I sealed the token inside a heavy-duty, tamper-proof security envelope. On Friday evening, 2 days before I was fired, I handed it directly to a certified federal courier to be transported straight back to the Government Defense Agency. Kyler was stepping into a highly technical, heavily regulated role completely empty-handed, permanently stripped of the actual physical tools required to do the job. The exact moment that the federal system processed my legal withdrawal and received my deactivated hardware token, the entire Aegis Core network infrastructure was instantly plunged into a deadly, invisible void. In the eyes of the massive government defense grid, Our corporate servers immediately transitioned into a red flag status officially designated as legally unsupervised. The automated compliance software that I had painstakingly built was still running in the background on our company servers, diligently packaging the weekly security reports and blindly firing them off into the cloud toward the Pentagon servers. But without my active digital signature and the rotating hardware token to authenticate the origin of the data, the military firewall immediately began intercepting every single transmission, every data packet, every system status update, and every server ping sent by Aegis Corps was instantly flagged, aggressively rejected, and permanently stamped with a massive digital unverified warning in the government logs. The absolute most brilliant and terrifying part of this entire automated catastrophe was the deafening silence that followed. In a normal, civilian corporate environment, a failed server transmission of that magnitude would immediately trigger an avalanche of loud, flashing error messages and urgent email notifications directly to the executive management team. But this was a highly classified military network. For strict national security reasons, the Pentagon systems do not broadcast broad warnings to unverified outside networks. The solely exclusive point of contact hard-coded into the Federal Registry to receive those critical error alerts was my highly encrypted, heavily restricted compliance email address, the very same email address that the Chief Executive Officer had triumphantly locked and permanently deleted from the company servers the exact moment I walked out the door on Monday morning. The government defense servers were silently screaming that a massive, potentially catastrophic security violation was occurring, but the only receiver capable of hearing those digital alarms had been intentionally smashed to pieces by the very people causing the breach. Kyler and his brother-in-law were completely blind, completely deaf, and happily steering a massive sinking ship straight toward the bottom of the ocean, absolutely convinced they were sailing toward victory. Through the inevitable court discovery documents, panicked text messages from former colleagues, and Kyler's own incredibly stupid public live stream, I was able to witness the entire catastrophic celebration unfold in glorious, high-definition detail. It was Thursday afternoon, and the executive suite at Aegis Corps Dynamics had been completely transformed into a grotesque monument of premature arrogance. Our chief executive officer had taken the last remaining scraps of the company credit line and thrown a lavish, obscenely expensive champagne reception right in the middle of the main floor. The catering staff was passing around silver platters of caviar, and an artificial ice sculpture of the company logo was melting onto the expensive hardwood floor. The reason for this chaotic display of wealth, the chief executive officer had received a completely non-binding, casual verbal agreement over a brief phone call with a few department generals regarding the $250 million contract. In the fast-paced, heavily diluted reality of tech startups, an executive might treat a verbal nod as guaranteed revenue, but in the cold, heavily fortified halls of the Pentagon, a verbal agreement is absolutely worthless until the final cryptographic ink dries on the digital page. Yet, the entire executive team was already clinking their crystal glasses together, completely blinded by the illusion of their massive payday. While the chief executive officer was busy slapping the backs of the desperate board members, Kyler was upstairs, basking in his unearned glory. I pulled up my social media feed from the comfort of my local pub and watched him broadcasting live to his few thousand followers. He was standing right in the center of my former workspace. The heavy mahogany bookshelves that once held my meticulous federal compliance binders had been violently shoved aside to make room for a massive, glowing neon sign spelling out the word, hustle. My ergonomic leather chair was gone, replaced by 3 brightly colored beanbag chairs and a professional ring light. Kyler was staring directly into his smartphone camera, wearing a designer suit jacket over a graphic t-shirt, confidently declaring himself to the world as a visionary genius. "You have to disrupt the legacy systems," Kyler told his audience, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the camera lens. "The government moves slow because they are bogged down by ancient bureaucracy, but I came in here and streamlined the entire pipeline. I am an absolute genius at restructuring government processes. We just secured $250 million because I optimized the workflow and brought artificial intelligence into the compliance matrix. It is all about working smarter, not harder. He was practically vibrating with self-satisfaction, entirely oblivious to the fact that his so-called optimized workflow was currently bleeding classified data onto a public server. But the universe has a highly specific, deeply poetic sense of timing. Right as Kyler was wrapping up his motivational speech, the digital clock on his monitor flipped to exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The deadline had arrived. Downstairs, the chief executive officer received an urgent automated ping from the military procurement portal. The Department of Defense was ready to officially initialize the contract and instantly release the first temporary advance payment of $50 million directly into the Aegis Corps bank accounts. There was only one final, mandatory hurdle remaining. The military system threw up a massive, red digital barricade on the screen, demanding the company upload the final, verified digital signature and the unique hardware token authentication from the legally registered facility security officer. The generals needed that specific cryptographic handshake to unlock the federal treasury. Suddenly, the champagne stopped flowing. The chief executive officer practically sprinted up the glass staircase, bursting into Kyler's neon-lit playground, sweating profusely and demanding the security token. Kyler, who had just ended his live stream, confidently turned to my old desk drawers. He began to rummage through the empty compartments, fully expecting to find a magical digital key left behind by the woman they had unceremoniously thrown out onto the street 4 days prior. Obviously, the drawers were completely empty. There was no physical token. There was no RSA secure ID device. There was absolutely nothing but dust and a few stray paperclips. A normal, rational human being in that exact situation would have immediately halted the entire operation and called legal counsel. But Kyler possessed the lethal combination of profound ignorance and massive technological arrogance. Cradled by his own delusional belief that he was the smartest man in the room, he simply waved his hand to calm down the hyperventilating chief executive officer, citing his vast experience in bypassing college firewall restrictions and manipulating cryptocurrency exchanges. Kyler decided to handle the United States military exactly like a stubborn video game level. "Relax. I can just patch this," Kyler sneered, pulling up a secondary keyboard. "It is just an automated compliance check. Machines cannot tell the difference between hardware and software. I will just emulate her old credentials." In a display of breathtaking stupidity that would later be studied in federal prosecution seminars, Kyler quickly downloaded a cheap, commercially available Internet Protocol spoofing software. He dug into the company's server cache, located the residual digital footprint of my deactivated administrative account, and forcefully reconstructed a fake, ghost version of my electronic signature. He genuinely believed that using a public proxy to mask his computer's location and slapping a forged digital stamp onto the government portal was a clever, innovative workaround. He thought he was outsmarting a mindless, bureaucratic algorithm. Kyler copied the forged data packet, dragged it over to the flashing red upload box on the Federal Defense portal, and violently slammed his finger down on the submit button. The loading wheel spun for 2 seconds. The screen flashed green. A generic automated message popped up acknowledging the receipt of the document. Kyler immediately threw his hands up in the air, let out a loud, victorious cheer, and loudly demanded someone pour him a fresh glass of champagne. The chief executive officer wiped the sweat from his forehead, breathing a massive sigh of relief, utterly convinced that their financial salvation was finally secured. They stood in my desecrated office, clapping each other on the shoulder, laughing at how easily they had conquered the system. They were celebrating a complete illusion. What Kyler failed to comprehend was that the United States Department of Defense does not run on simple commercial web scripts. By pressing that submit button, Kyler had not found a clever tech loophole. In the strict, unforgiving eyes of federal law, he had just committed intentional identity theft, actively bypassed a national security firewall, and successfully executed a textbook case of Level 1 wire fraud directly against the United States military. The trap had not just snapped shut. The heavy steel doors of a federal penitentiary had effectively locked right behind him. Exactly 12 minutes. That was the entire lifespan of their pathetic victory. For exactly 12 minutes after Kyler hit that submit button, the executive floor of Aegis Core Dynamics remained a carnival of unearned arrogance. But deep inside the heavily fortified server farms of the Pentagon, a massive, unfeeling digital beast had just been awakened. The United States military does not employ human clerks to manually verify incoming data packets at the first security checkpoint. They utilize highly classified, automated threat detection algorithms explicitly designed to hunt down foreign adversaries and neutralize cyber threats in fractions of a second. The exact moment Kyler's spoofed, violently forged digital signature touched the outer firewall of the defense portal, the government system instantly recognized the cryptographic anomaly. It did not just flag the file for a later review, it triggered an immediate automated national security protection protocol. Back in Denver, the technological slaughter was instantaneous and completely silent. Every single network gateway connecting the Aegis Core infrastructure to the federal government was violently slammed shut. Down in the company server room, the massive routing switches glowed a solid, terrifying red before locking down entirely, physically severing all outgoing and incoming military communications. The entire corporation was digitally quarantined by the United States government in the blink of an eye. Upstairs, the chief executive officer was still holding his half-empty glass of expensive champagne when the direct encrypted red phone on his massive oak desk began to ring. It was a dedicated, secure line strictly reserved for high-level military communications. A massive, greedy smile stretched across his flushed face. He eagerly picked up the receiver, fully expecting to hear the warm, congratulatory voice of a procurement officer confirming the immediate wire transfer of the $50 million advance. Instead, the voice on the other end of the line was as cold and hard as wet concrete. It was the chief of cybersecurity for the Department of Defense. I am calling to formally notify you that all negotiations regarding your pending contract are effectively suspended, the federal officer stated, his voice completely devoid of any human emotion. We have detected a severe, unauthorized cryptographic breach originating directly from your primary Internet Protocol address. The Pentagon is officially opening a federal criminal investigation into your organization for suspected cyber espionage and unauthorized network intrusion. Do not attempt to access the portal again. Federal agents will be in contact. The secure line went dead. The chief executive officer dropped his crystal glass. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending expensive champagne splashing across his custom leather shoes. He stood completely frozen behind his desk, the blood violently draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of the situation crushed the breath out of his lungs. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally erupted across the executive suite. He screamed at the top of his lungs for the head of the corporate legal department, the general counsel, a usually calm, impeccably dressed man who was paid entirely too much money to protect the board of directors, came sprinting down the hallway, his tie completely crooked. The chief executive officer frantically recounted the terrifying phone call. The lawyer immediately shoved past him, hijacked the desktop computer, and demanded direct access to the central compliance logs. They bypassed Kyler entirely, logging straight into the administrative backend of the network. It took the frantic legal team exactly 4 minutes of desperate digging to uncover the fatal, inescapable truth. There, sitting perfectly time-stamped in the unalterable system registry, was my formal, legally binding government withdrawal document. The lawyer stared at the glowing monitor, his hands physically shaking over the keyboard. "She is gone," the lawyer whispered, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. "She legally withdrew her oversight credentials and notified the federal government before she was even officially terminated. She is completely clean. She has zero legal liability." The chief executive officer grabbed the lawyer by the shoulders, shaking him aggressively, demanding a solution, demanding to know how the military portal accepted a digital signature just 12 minutes ago if I had already wiped my credentials from the system. The lawyer slowly looked up, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization of their impending doom. "Because your newly appointed director did not find a clever technical workaround," the lawyer screamed, finally losing his carefully maintained professional composure. "He just actively spoofed a federal network and submitted a forged security document directly to the United States Army. He just committed a massive federal felony on our company servers." The delayed wave of absolute, uncontrollable rage finally hit the chief executive officer. He let out a primal, guttural yell, lifted his expensive smartphone off the desk, and hurled it violently against the brick wall of his office, shattering it into a dozen plastic and glass fragments. He stormed out of his suite, his face flushed a dangerous shade of purple with fury, and charged heavily up the glass staircase toward the corner office. He kicked the heavy wooden door open so hard it bounced off the wall. Kyler was no longer live-streaming his visionary wisdom to the internet. The smug, arrogant crypto bro persona had completely evaporated into thin air. Kyler was backed into the far corner of the room, standing awkwardly next to his ridiculous glowing neon sign, trembling uncontrollably. His face was the sickly color of dirty ash. He was frantically mashing his fingers against his keyboard, staring blankly at the blazing red error messages flooding his dual monitors, completely failing to comprehend the catastrophic magnitude of his actions. "I do not understand," Kyler stuttered, his voice high-pitched, breathless, and frantic. The artificial intelligence software was supposed to emulate the data path seamlessly. The machine learning algorithm should have masked the protocol. It was just a simple patch. The machines are not supposed to know the difference. The chief executive officer did not say a single word. He simply marched across the room, grabbed Kyler's designer computer monitor with both hands, and violently shoved it completely off the desk, sending it crashing and shattering against the floorboards. In a matter of seconds, the entire executive team shifted from untouchable arrogance to pure, unadulterated desperation. They urgently needed a scapegoat, or better yet, they needed a savior. They needed the very woman they had cruelly and mockingly thrown out onto the street. A chaotic, profoundly pathetic hunt immediately began. The human resources director started frantically dialing my personal cell phone number over and over again, pacing holes into the hallway carpet. The chief executive officer demanded his assistant send continuous text messages to my phone, promising massive financial bonuses, an immediate promotion to the executive board, and absolutely anything I wanted if I would just come back and fix the supposedly tiny error. When every single one of those desperate calls went straight to an automated carrier voicemail stating the number was no longer in service, the desperation escalated into total madness. They actually dispatched a junior operations manager to jump into his car and drive dangerously fast directly to my apartment complex on the other side of the city to beg me in person. But the breathless junior manager arrived to find absolutely nothing. He stood alone in the quiet residential hallway, aggressively knocking his knuckles raw on a freshly painted door. A highly confused maintenance worker eventually stepped out of the elevator and informed him that the previous tenant had completely broken her lease, entirely cleared out the residential unit, and handed the physical brass keys back to the landlord exactly 3 days ago. I was not just missing. I had systematically and ruthlessly erased my entire existence from their world. They were completely alone in the burning building they had arrogantly set on fire, desperately screaming for the very person who had quietly walked out the front door carrying the only fire extinguisher. The inevitable consequence of absolute arrogance is that it always ends in a deeply public humiliation. The final judgment day arrived on a remarkably quiet Thursday morning, exactly 3 days after the disastrous champagne celebration. The heavy glass doors of the Aegis Core Dynamics lobby were forcefully pushed open. A synchronized team of federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by heavily armed inspectors from the Department of Defense, marched straight past the terrified receptionist. They were all wearing identical dark black windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs. They did not stop at the security desk. They did not ask for permission. They swarmed the executive floor and immediately descended into the basement server rooms. In front of the entire, completely silent staff of terrified employees, The federal agents began violently yanking heavy cables from the wall, physically confiscating every single piece of hardware that contained the tainted corporate network. Bright red evidence tape was slapped across the glass doors of the server farm, permanently sealing the fate of the company. Upstairs, the true cost of nepotism was finally being paid in full. The federal agents marched Kyler right out of the corner office he had stolen from me. The smug, visionary tech executive was completely gone. In his place was a sobbing, broken man. His ridiculously expensive designer t-shirt was thoroughly soaked in cold sweat, clinging to his shaking frame as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. The federal officers loudly read him his rights, formally charging him with multiple counts of severe federal wire fraud and direct violations of the Espionage Act. He was being hauled away to a federal holding cell, staring down the barrel of a multi-year prison sentence. The $250 million contract was not just paused, it was officially, permanently terminated. The military also slapped Aegis Core Dynamics with a catastrophic financial penalty for the data breach. A fine so massive that the corporate attorneys immediately began drafting Chapter 11 bankruptcy papers before Kyler was even loaded into the back of the armored government vehicle. While that chaotic nightmare was unfolding, I was sitting exactly 10 miles away, perfectly insulated from the destruction. I was comfortably settled into a breathtaking new chair inside a massive, open-concept corner office situated on the 40th floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in the bustling downtown commercial district. My new workspace was exactly twice the size of the one I had left behind, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed, panoramic view of the entire city skyline. I was sitting inside the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Systems, the single largest, most aggressive market competitor Aegis Core had ever faced. The beautiful, unspoken truth about the defense contracting industry is that the federal government always requires a highly qualified backup plan. During that very first week after I was fired, while my former colleagues thought I was mourning the loss of my career in a dark pub, I was actually executing a flawless pivot. I had quietly taken my absolutely spotless, federally recognized compliance record and my pristine national security clearance straight to the executive board of Vanguard Systems. They knew exactly who I was. They knew my reputation for building impenetrable, military-grade security infrastructures. They welcomed me with wide-open arms, utilizing my highly specialized expertise and my active security credentials. Vanguard Systems had rapidly finalized an emergency secondary bid for the exact same military virtualization project. We were the silent predators waiting in the tall grass for Aegis Core to stumble. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, the smooth surface cool against my skin, and picked up a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I turned my attention to the large flat-screen television mounted on my pristine white wall, which was currently broadcasting the live afternoon financial news network. The news anchor practically beamed as she delivered the breaking market update. The United States Department of Defense had just officially announced a massive reallocation of federal funds. They were immediately redirecting the monumental $250 million encryption contract directly to Vanguard Systems, citing our vastly superior, deeply verified security protocols. Right at that exact moment of absolute victory, my secured desk phone began to vibrate violently. The caller identification screen flashed the frantic, unlisted cell phone number of my former chief executive officer. I could easily picture him standing in the ruins of his bankrupt company, desperately begging for mercy from the woman he had completely underestimated. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my warm coffee. A genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth as I looked out over the endless city horizon. I calmly pressed the red button, permanently rejecting his final, pathetic plea for salvation. I then reached across my massive mahogany desk, picked up my heavy fountain pen, and confidently signed my very first legally binding document as the newly appointed Executive Vice President of Compliance for a brand new empire. The man who had arrogantly stolen my office was now facing a cold jail cell, and I had just inherited the entire kingdom. Thank you all so sincerely for taking the time to listen to my story today. Where are you currently listening to this story from? Please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's story entertaining and satisfying, please kindly support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly exclusive true revenge stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube due to the disabled monetization. You can easily join our community by scanning the QR code right here on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment section. Your support means everything to us.